The padlock is new. Heavy silver thing that gleams in the afternoon sun, holding the chain tight against the black iron gate I designed on a cocktail napkin 3 years ago. My name is Thomas. I am 62 years old, and everything I own is sitting inside the house behind that wall. A home I poured my life into, but am now legally forbidden to enter. It is a strange sensation to stand in the dust of a road you used to drive down every day, looking at a garden you planted with your own hands, knowing that if you take one step closer, the police will be called to escort you away from your own dream. I'm not here to yell or to cut the chain, and I'm certainly not here to beg for a set of keys, because I learned too late that keys don't matter when you don't own the law. I am just standing here for a moment to look at the bougainvillea spilling over the stucco, trying to understand how a man who ran a successful logistics company for 30 years, a man who thought he knew how to read contracts and people, could let himself be erased so completely from his own life. To understand why I'm standing outside this gate with nothing but a suitcase back at a cheap hotel, you have to understand the silence I was running away from. 3 years ago, I was living in a suburb just outside of Chicago, existing in a house that had become too big and too quiet after my divorce and my daughter's departure for college. Retirement wasn't the golden era I had been promised in the brochures. It was a slow, gray suffocation, where the highlight of my week was the grocery run, and the silence in the evenings was so loud it made my ears ring. I had money, I had health, but I didn't have a reason to get out of bed in the morning. And that lack of purpose acts like a rust that eats you from the inside out. I looked at the next 20 years of my life and saw nothing but a straight, flat line leading to a nursing home, and that terrified me more than death itself. I wanted color, I wanted heat, I wanted to feel like the protagonist of my own life again. So I did what so many men my age do when they feel the cold wind of mortality. I packed up, sold the big house in the suburbs, and bought a one-way ticket to Mexico. When I first arrived in this town, it felt like I had stepped from a black and white movie into Technicolor. The air smelled of roasted corn and diesel and blooming jasmine, and for the first time in years, my heart rate quickened not out of anxiety, but out of sheer, unadulterated excitement. I rented a modest apartment with a view of the mountains, and I told myself I was going to learn Spanish. I was going to hike, I was going to paint, I was going to be the interesting man I never had time to be when I was working 60 hours a week. It was in this state of wide-eyed vulnerability, this desperate openness to the world, that I met Luciana. She wasn't a shark circling in the water, or at least she didn't look like one. She was 42 with a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes and a quiet dignity that drew me in immediately. She worked at the bakery where I bought my coffee every morning, and at first, it was just polite exchanges, me butchering the language, and her patiently correcting my pronunciation with a soft laugh that made me feel like I was in on the joke rather than the butt of it. I think it is important to admit with the brutal honesty of hindsight that I was starving for attention. I was a man who had spent 30 years being the boss or the dad, roles that required me to be strong and invisible, and suddenly Hugh was a woman who looked at me not as a function, but as a man. We started having lunch together, then dinners, and she showed me the parts of the town that tourists never saw, the hidden waterfalls and the best street taco stands. She told me about her life, her struggles raising a son on her own, her dreams of one day having a place that was truly hers, and I listened with the intensity of a man who finally felt useful again. I didn't see the trap because I was too busy looking at the reflection of myself in her eyes, a reflection that looked younger, stronger, and more capable than I had felt in a decade. The relationship moved with the easy, intoxicating speed of vacation romance that refuses to end. Within 6 months, I was spending more nights at her small, cramped rental than at my own apartment. We were a team, or so I thought. I helped her with rent when her hours were cut. Not because she asked, but because I wanted to. It felt good to be the provider, to solve problems with a swipe of a card. It fed my ego, and that ego was the very thing that blinded me to the reality of the dynamic we were building. I was the savior, and she was the grateful beauty, and in that antiquated script, I lost the ability to ask the hard questions. I met her family, her mother, her sisters, her brothers, and they welcomed me with open arms, calling me with open arms, calling me Tio Thomas, and inviting me to every birthday and baptism. I had gone from being a lonely ghost in Chicago to the patriarch of a large, vibrant family in Mexico, and the feeling of belonging was a drug more potent than anything you can buy in a pharmacy. The conversation about the house didn't happen all at once. It started as a daydream we shared while sitting on the hood of my car looking out over a piece of land her father owned on the edge of town. It was just a dusty plot of scrub brush and cactus then, but Luciana saw a garden and I saw a fortress where we could be safe. She sighed and said how sad it was that the land was sitting there useless because the family didn't have the money to build on it, and how she hated seeing me throw money away on rent every month for an apartment that wasn't ours. The logic was insidious and perfect. Why should I pay a stranger rent when I could invest that money into a home for us? She explained, with a furrowed brow of concern, that foreigners couldn't directly own land in this specific zone because it was ejido land, communal property passed down through families. But she said it didn't matter because we were partners. She said her father would sign the rights over to her, and I would pay for the construction, and it would be our home. I remember sitting there looking at a patch of dirt and doing the mental math. I had a significant nest egg from the sale of my Chicago house. The cost of building here was a fraction of what it would be in the States. I could build a palace here for the price of a condo back home, but it wasn't the financial math that made the decision, it was the emotional math. I wanted to cement this new life. I wanted to put roots down so deep that I could never be uprooted again. I wanted to prove to her, and perhaps to myself, that I was all in. I didn't consult a lawyer because I didn't want to insult her family. I didn't ask for a contract because I thought our love was the contract. I looked at her and I said, let's do it. Let's build it. And in that moment, as she hugged me with tears in her eyes, I felt like the smartest man in the world, never realizing I had just signed the warrant for my own destruction. We broke ground 2 months later. I remember the day the excavator arrived, the rumble of the diesel engine shaking the ground beneath my feet. I stood there with Luciana's father, a quiet man who shook my hand firmly, and I felt a surge of pride. I was building something. I was creating a legacy. I paid the contractor in cash, peeling the bills off a thick stack I had withdrawn from the bank, feeling powerful and generous. We sat over plans at the kitchen table late into the night, arguing playfully over where the master bedroom should face and whether we needed a guest casita. I insisted on the best materials: marble for the floors, mahogany for the cabinets, imported fixtures for the bathrooms. I wanted it to be perfect. I wanted it to be a testament to the second chance at life. Every bag of cement, every rebar rod, every tile was paid for from my account. And with every payment, I felt more and more secure, anchoring myself to this woman and this land. The construction phase was the happiest time of our relationship. We were united by a common project. I was at the site every day, supervising the workers, learning the vocabulary of construction in Spanish, feeling the sun on my back. Luciana would bring me lunch, and we would eat tacos sitting on stacks of bricks, pointing out where the bougainvillea would go, where we would put the hammock. I was completely, blissfully unaware that I was building a cage. I didn't notice the way her brother started looking at the house, not as my home, but as a family asset. I didn't notice that my name was on a single piece of official paper. Not the building permit, not the utility contracts, nothing. I was the bank, the architect, and the dreamer. But on paper, I was a ghost. One afternoon, about 6 months into the build, the walls were up and the roof was being poured. I was standing on the second floor terrace looking out at the view of the valley, a view that I had paid for, and a strange cold thought pricked the back of my neck. I realized that if I walked away right then, I would have nothing to show for the hundreds of thousands of dollars I had already spent. But then Luciana came up the stairs, wiping dust from her hands, and she smiled at me, that warm, reassuring smile that made me feel 10 feet tall. She put her arm around my waist and said, "It's almost ready, my love, almost home." And I pushed the cold thought away, burying it under layers of hope and denial. I told myself that love was about trust, and that trusting her was the brave thing to do. I didn't know then that there is a fine line between bravery and stupidity, and I was dancing right on the edge of it. The house was finished in late November. It was beautiful. It was everything I had ever wanted. Open, airy, filled with light, a true sanctuary. We moved in on a Tuesday. I remember carrying my few boxes of clothes into the walk-in closet, hanging my shirts next to hers, feeling a sense of permanent arrival. We threw a massive party for the housewarming. Her entire extended family came, cousins I hadn't even met yet, filling the courtyard with music and laughter. I stood by the grill, flippant carne asada, accepting slaps on the back and congratulations. "Bien hecho, Thomas," they said. Well done. I look around at the house, at the woman laughing with her sisters in the kitchen, at the life I had constructed out of nothing, and I felt a profound sense of peace. I thought I had beaten the odds. But as the sun went down and the music got louder, I didn't notice the way Luciana was whispering with her brother in the corner, or the way her mother looked at me with a gaze that was no longer welcoming, but calculating. The house was done. The money was spent. The asset was complete. And unbeknownst to me, my utility had just expired. The invasion didn't happen with a kick to the door. It happened with a set of keys. I had made 3 copies, one for me, one for Luciana, and a spare for emergencies. But within a month of the housewarming party, I started noticing new faces letting themselves in through the front gate. First, it was her younger sister, dropping by to use the washing machine because hers was broken. Then it was a cousin who needed a quiet place to study. Then it was her brother, the one who had whispered in the corner at the party, parking his truck in the driveway I had paved, leaving oil stains on the stone and helping himself to the beer in the refrigerator. When I asked Luciana about it, she looked at me with wide, innocent eyes and told me I didn't understand the culture. In Mexico, family is everything, she said, brushing a hand against my cheek. We share. You are so American, Thomas, always wanting to be alone. She made my desire for privacy sound like a defect, a cold selfishness that I needed to unlearn. And because I wanted so desperately to belong, I swallowed my frustration and let the sister do her laundry. The house, my sanctuary, slowly transformed into a community center where I was a sole benefactor, but had no voting rights. I would come home from a walk to find strangers in my living room watching soccer on the 65-inch television I had bought. They would nod at me, polite but dismissive, as if I were a roommate. They tolerated rather than the man who owned the roof over their heads. The utility bills skyrocketed, electricity, water, gas, and every peso came out of my pocket. When I tried to bring this up, to suggest that perhaps the family could chip in if they were going to use the house as their own, the atmosphere in the room would drop 20 degrees. Luciana would get quiet, her shoulders stiffening, and later, in the privacy of our bedroom, she would cry. She would tell me how embarrassed she was, how her family thought I was a miser, a rich man who counted pennies while her people struggled, and I, the fool, would apologize. I would apologize for asking people to pay for what they consumed, terrified that my American greed was ruining the love story I had built. It wasn't just the space they took, it was the authority. I remember coming home one Tuesday to find a wall in the garden being painted a bright, garish blue. I hadn't asked for it. I hadn't agreed with. Her uncle was there with a roller, humming a tune. When I asked what was happening, Luciana came out and explained that her mother thought the white was too clinical, too hospital-like, and that blue brought good energy. I stood there, staring at the wet paint covering the expensive stucco work I had paid for, and I realized with a sinking feeling that my opinion was no longer required. I was the wallet, not the homeowner. I tried to argue to say that it was my house and I liked white. But the argument spun in circles until I was the one apologizing for shouting, for disrespecting her elder, for not appreciating the favor the uncle was doing. The blue wall stayed, a permanent reminder of my dwindling leverage. The intimacy between us began to change, too. It became transactional, though I didn't want to admit it at the time. The affection, the long dinners, the laughter, this seemed to appear only when a financial need was met. An unexpected car repair for her son, a medical bill for her aunt, a tuition payment for a niece. If I wrote the check, the warmth returned, the I love yous were plentiful. But if I hesitated, if I asked questions, the house would go cold. I started to feel a deep, gnawing loneliness, a specific kind of isolation that comes from sleeping next to someone who is calculating your worth while you are dreaming of their love. I would lie awake at night, listening to the dogs barking in the distance, tracing the cracks in the ceiling with my eyes, wondering when exactly I had lost control. I was living in the paradise I had paid for, yet I felt like a guest who had overstayed his welcome. The breaking point of this second phase came 6 months in, on a hot afternoon in May. I walked into the kitchen to find Luciana's adult son, a boy of 22 who had never held a steady job, sitting at my kitchen island with a set of blueprints. He was talking to a contractor I didn't know. They were discussing the guest casita, the one I used as my painting studio, the one place I still had to myself. I heard the son say, when we knock this wall down, we can make it a rental unit for tourists. I froze in the doorway. We? I asked, my voice trembling not with anger, but with shock. The son didn't even flinch. He looked at me with a terrifying calmness and said, Mom said it's a waste of space. We need income. We. The word hung in the air like smoke. I looked at Luciana, who was standing by the stove, refusing to meet my eyes. That was the moment the fog finally cleared. I realized they weren't just using the house, they were planning a future for it, a business, a life. And in that future, I was just the initial investor who was slowly being phased out. I wasn't the patriarch, I was the stepping stone. The argument that followed that discovery in the kitchen wasn't the loud, plate-smashing kind you see in movies. It was quiet, venomous, and absolutely devastating. I asked the contractor to leave, my voice shaking, and when the door clicked shut, I turned to Luciana and asked her simply, "Since when is my studio, the place I paint, up for a negotiation?" She didn't apologize. She didn't cry. He leaned against the counter, crossed her arms, and looked at me with a coldness I had never seen before. A look that stripped away 2 years of intimacy in a single second. She told me I was being selfish. She said I was a rich man sitting on a gold mine while our son struggled to buy diapers for his own baby. She twisted the narrative so fast that I got whiplash, turning my desire to keep my own space into an act of cruelty against her family. And then, when I finally snapped and shouted that I had paid for every brick in this house, she played the card I had been dreading since the day we broke ground. "You pay for the bricks, Thomas," she said, her voice steady and low. "But the ground they sit on is mine. My father's name is on the deed. My name is on the utilities. You are here because we love you, not because you own anything." The air left the room. It was the first time the legal reality had been spoken out loud. What the nice to end an argument. I stood there, paralyzed by the truth of it. I had built a castle on sand, and the tide was finally coming. I tried to argue moral ownership, equity, the promises we made in the dark, but she just shook her head and locked out, leaving me standing in a kitchen that suddenly felt like enemy territory. That night I slept in the guest room, the very room they wanted to turn into a rental, with the door locked, listening to the murmurs of her and her son talking in the living room, plotting the future of a house I was still paying the electric bill for. For the next week, the house was a war zone of silence. I stopped going to the paint store. I stopped walking in the garden. I stayed in that guest room, furiously researching Mexican property law on my laptop, only to find forum after forum of horror stories exactly like mine. "Ejido is untouchable," the lawyers wrote. "If you're not a Mexican citizen and you don't have a bank trust, you have nothing." I read those words until they blurred, the nausea rising in my throat. I realized I was trapped. If I left, I lost the investment. If I stayed, I was living as a hostage to her family's whims. I was 62 years old, and I was hiding in a bedroom in a house where I'd chosen the tile, the paint, and the curtains, terrified to go out and make a cup of coffee because I couldn't bear the smug look on her son's face. Then the dynamic shifted again. Luciana came to me on a Friday evening, bringing me a plate of food, her eyes soft and rimmed with red. She sat on the edge of the bed and apologized. She said she was stressed, that the family was pressuring her, that she didn't mean what she said about the land. She cried, and because I was a man drowning in regret and desperate for a lifeline, I let her comfort me. She held my hand and said, "We just need a reset, Thomas. The tension is too high. Why don't you take a trip, go visit your daughter in Chicago for a week or two, see the baby? Come back when things are calm and we will fix this. We will go to a lawyer and work out a contract." It sounded so reasonable. It sounded like the mature, loving solution. I was exhausted, physically and emotionally. And the idea of escaping this pressure cooker for a week, of seeing my own daughter, felt like salvation. I booked a flight for 3 days later. I packed a suitcase, leaving my paints, my books, my winter clothes, and my furniture exactly where they were. I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her because the alternative, that this was a calculated move to get me physically off the property, was too painful to accept. On the morning I left, she drove me to the airport. She kissed me goodbye at the terminal, a long, lingering kiss that felt like the old days. "Hurry back," she whispered against my ear. "The house will be waiting for you." I walked through security, feeling a weight lift off my chest, thinking that distance would give us perspective, thinking that we could salvage this. I didn't know then that the moment I stepped through those sliding glass doors, I had crossed the threshold I would never be allowed to cross back over. I boarded the plane to Chicago, a man taking a vacation, completely unaware that I just voluntarily evacuated the only leverage I had left, my physical presence. Chicago was cold, a wet, gray chill that seeped into your bones. But for the first few days, I didn't mind. I sat in my daughter's living room, drinking coffee that tasted like home, and I caught myself defending the very situation I had fled. When my daughter asked why I hadn't put my name on the deed, I gave her the same rehearsed speech Luciana had given me. "It's complicated, honey. It's the culture. You have to trust the process." I was lying to her, and I was lying to myself, trying to keep the fantasy alive for just a few more days because the alternative, admitting I had been a fool, was too heavy to carry. I showed her pictures of the garden, the bougainvillea in full bloom, the studio where I was going to paint my masterpiece. I was selling her a dream that was already dead, though I didn't know it yet. The silence started on day 5. I tested Luciana to say good morning, to tell her I missed the sun, and for the first time in 2 years, she didn't reply. By the evening, I called. It went straight to voicemail. I told myself it was the signal, the weather, a lost charger. But by day 7, the silence had a texture to it, a specific heavy weight that settled in my stomach. I called her sister, no answer. I called her sister, no answer. I called her son, blocked. The panic didn't hit me all at once. It came in a slow, creeping wave. I booked an earlier flight back, paying a ridiculous change fee, telling my daughter I had an urgent matter with the house construction. I hugged her goodbye and she looked at me with a worry she didn't voice, a look that said she knew I was running back to a burning building. The taxi ride from the airport to the town felt interminable. I watched the familiar landscape roll by the dusty roads, the vibrant storefronts, but the colors seemed muted now, stripped of the romance I had projected onto them. When the taxi turned onto our street, my heart was hammering against my ribs. I saw the house rising above the wall, the terracotta roof tiles glowing in the afternoon light, and for a split second, I felt a surge of relief. It was still there. It was real. I paid the driver and grabbed my suitcase, walking to the heavy iron gate I had designed myself. I pulled out my keyring, the metal warm in my hand, and slid the key into the lock. It stopped halfway. I jiggled it. I pulled it out and tried again. It didn't turn. I bent down, squinting in the sun, and realized with a jolt of nausea that the cylinder was brand new. The scratches on the metal were fresh. Luciana, I called out, rattling the gate. Luciana, it's Tana's! The house was silent. The windows were dark. I called again, louder this time, panic stripping the dignity from my voice. Open the gate. My key doesn't work. A curtain twitched in the upstairs bedroom, our bedroom. I saw a silhouette, a flash of movement, and then it was gone. Moments later, the front door opened, but it wasn't Luciana who stepped out. It was her son. He walked across the courtyard with a slow, arrogant stride, stopping 10 feet from the gate. He didn't have a key in his hand. He had a phone. He looked at me through the bars, not with anger, but with a boredom that was infinitely more cruel. Go away, Thomas, he said. You don't live here anymore. I gripped the bars, my knuckles turning white. What are you talking about? I built this house. My clothes are in there. My paintings are in there. Open the damn gate. He just shook his head and lifted the phone. I'm calling the police. You are trespassing. I laughed, a sharp hissing salt. Trespassing, I paid for every inch of concrete you're standing on. But he didn't argue. He didn't engage. He just dialed 3 numbers and put the phone to his ear, staring at me with dead eyes. I stood there, shaking the gate, shouting for Luciana, begging her to come out, to explain, to stop this madness. But the house remained a tomb. She was in there. I knew she was in there. And her silence was louder than any scream. The police arrived in less than 10 minutes. 2 officers in a beat-up truck, looking tired and uninterested. They got out and approached me, hands resting on their belts. I started explaining immediately, in my Spanish tumbling out in a broken, desperate rush. I told them about the construction, the bank transfers, the relationship. I told them my passport was inside, my medication, my life. The older officer held up a hand to stop me. He turned to the son, who was still standing safely behind the gate. They exchanged a few words in rapid-fire slang I couldn't catch, and then the son produced a piece of paper. A deed. He held it up for the officer to see. The officer nodded, turned back to me, and asked the only question that mattered in the eyes of the law. Senor, is your name on this paper? No, I whispered. But? Then you have no rights here, the officer said, his voice flat. This is private property. You are causing a disturbance. You need to leave now, or we will take you to the station. I looked up at the window again. The curtain moved. She was watching the man she had claimed to love being threatened with arrest for trying to enter his own home. And in that moment, staring at the closed curtain, I realized the most painful truth of all. This wasn't a sudden decision. This wasn't a fight. This was the plan. The Chicago trip. The reset. The argument, it was all choreography to get me out the door so they could change the locks without a confrontation. I hadn't been a partner. I'd been a project, and the project was finished. I picked up my suitcase, the dust swirling around my shoes, and I walked away from the gate without looking back, leaving $300,000 and 2 years of my life behind a wall I had paid to build. I am living now in a small studio apartment about 20 minutes from the house I built. It has a single window that looks out into a brick wall, and the kitchen is just a hot plate and a mini fridge. It is a far cry from the marble floors and the valley views I paid for, but strangely, I sleep better here. I spent the first 3 months after the eviction in a rage that nearly killed me. I hired lawyers who took my retainer fees and then told me what I already knew. The law in Mexico protects the land, not the investor, especially when that investor is a foreigner who thought a handshake and a kiss were binding contracts. I showed them bank statements, receipts, emails, mountains of evidence that I had paid for every single thing inside those walls. The judge didn't even look up. He simply asked for the title. When I couldn't produce it, the case was dismissed. The legal system here isn't broken. It worked exactly as it was designed to, protecting the family, the blood, the soil. I was just the rain that watered their crop. And once the harvest was in, the rain was no longer needed. I see them sometimes around town. I saw Luciana, some driving my car, a customized Jeep I had left in the driveway, laughing with his friends. I saw Luciana once at the market buying fruit. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second, and she didn't look malicious or even triumphant. She looked through me. It was the look you'd give a stranger, or perhaps a ghost. In that moment, the anger that had been poisoning my blood for months finally broke, and underneath it, I found something much harder to look at: my own complicity. It is easy to paint her as the villain, the black widow who spun a web to catch a lonely old gringo. And maybe she was. Maybe the plan was hatched the moment she saw my watch on our first date. But I have to be honest enough to admit that I walked into that web with my eyes wide open, because the web felt like a safety net. I wanted to be the hero. That is the truth I have been avoiding. I wanted to be the man who swooped in and fixed everything. I wanted to be the patriarch, the provider, the benevolent king of a kingdom I bought rather than earned. I used my money as a shortcut to intimacy, thinking that if I solved their problems, they would have to love me. I didn't just build a house. I tried to purchase a sense of belonging. I ignored the warnings, the laws, and my own gut instinct because the fantasy of being T.O. Thomas, the man who made dreams come true, was more addictive than the reality of being a lonely retiree in a foreign country. I handed them the weapon they used to destroy me, and I polished it every time I wrote a check without asking for a receipt. To anyone watching this, sitting in a quiet house in Ohio or Florida or Manchester, dreaming of selling it all and finding a second act in paradise, do it. Come to Mexico. Eat the food, swim in the ocean, learn the language, but do not confuse the warmth of the sun with the warmth of a person who needs you to survive. There is a profound and dangerous difference between being loved and being useful. When you are loved, you are indispensable because of who you are. When you are useful, you are indispensable only until you run out of use. I made myself useful. I made myself a wallet, an architect, a problem solver, and when the house was finished, when the problems were solved, I became obsolete. I lost $300,000. I lost 2 years of my life. I lost my trust in people, which is the hardest thing to earn back. But I'm still standing. I drink my coffee in this small dark apartment, and for the first time in years, the silence doesn't frighten me. I am not buying anyone's affection today. I am not waiting for a conditional smile. I am poorer than I have ever been, but I am also freer than I have ever been. That house on the hill with its bougainvillea and its iron gate, it isn't my home. It never was. It is a monument to my vanity. My home is right here, in this hard-won clarity, in the realization that I am enough, all by myself, without a single brick to prove it. I'm 62 years old, and I am starting over from zero. It is terrifying. It is unfair, but it is terrifying. It is unfair, but it is the truth. And finally, the truth is the only thing I own.